My name is Adam Busiakiewicz, and I'm a historian of Warwick Castle and its Earls. I'm here today to talk about the life of Elizabeth Hamilton, 1st Countess Brooke and 1st Countess of Warwick. Elizabeth was born in 1720 and died in 1800, and it's quite clear that her life was dedicated to her passions, to art, architecture, and of course to the education of her incredibly talented children. But it's interesting also to note that during her 40s, she actually embarked on a love affair, which resulted in the very painful and public separation from her husband, the Earl of Warwick. Despite Elizabeth's fascinating life, her biography has never been treated in any serious or meaningful way. So during this quiet moment, I thought I'd at least give it a go. You're probably wondering what makes me qualified to talk about her. Well, I've spent many years of my life actually researching Elizabeth's former home, Warwick Castle. This is what it looked like when Elizabeth was living there in 1752, when the great Canaletto, nonetheless, came to paint 5 views of her ancient and very beautiful medieval home. But really, for me, as a researcher of Warwick Castle, what has always fascinated me is the archive of the castle, which has been in the collection of the Warwickshire County Record Office since the late 1970s, but due to several reasons, has not always been as thoroughly catalogued as you might expect. Indeed, 1,000 boxes came out of the castle, and only a handful at the time were thoroughly catalogued. And a few years ago, in fact, I decided to give myself the task of undertaking a doctoral research and spent lots of time looking at boxes like this, filled to the brim with papers that deserve, well, research. And really, I think if you've ever heard of a Countess of Warwick, and particularly a scandalous one that has always captured the public imagination, then it's probably a countess who lived much later than Elizabeth. It's probably this countess that you might have heard of, Frances, known to her friends as Daisy, the 5th Countess of Warwick, who in the late 19th and early 20th century caused absolute scandal for several reasons. She was the favourite mistress of Edward, the Prince of Wales. She also later became a very ardent and fervent socialist, and even stood for the Labour Party in the general election of the 1920s. She also had several children, including this little boy in this painting here, which were not born, by her husband, the Earl, which I suppose has always captured the public imagination. We're always out there looking for a good love story, aren't we? But my, I suppose, research has always, and particularly been interested in very often overlooked figures, particularly female figures in the history of Warwick Castle, which might have influenced the history of the place and the family and all of these interesting connections and stories which have been forgotten by time. In fact, my doctoral research was looking at a 19th century countess, Anne Greville, the 4th Countess of Warwick, who was a phenomenally talented artist. In fact, my research was particularly looking at the enormously important influence Anne had, particularly in the redecoration of the castle after an enormous fire there, which happened in 1871. She was a great painter. She painted on ceramics. She was a sculptor. She was interested in interior design. She was a bookbinder, and Anne was also a photographer. So there are all of these stories that you can put together when you start looking at the papers of the period. And one of the figures that I came across several years ago that was of great interest was, well, the subject of today's podcast, Elizabeth. One of the reasons that I became fascinated by her is that you sort of come across Elizabeth's papers and letters in very unexpected places. And the truth is that the 18th century material, 18th century letters, are actually very far and few between in the archive. And so you have to sort of spend lots of time thinking about how they connect, where other letters might exist. And it's something about Elizabeth that is always sort of, you constantly encounter her in very unexpected and very interesting places. And the letters that do survive by hers really give us a sense of what a fascinating and very incredibly capable and talented and very passionate woman she was, which is really what this podcast is dedicated to. Now, where do we start? Well, of course, we always have to start with the youth and upbringing of somebody when investigating a biography, of course. And it's quite true to say that Elizabeth had a phenomenally interesting childhood. I wish I knew more, more descriptions of it, let's say, but the context must have been very interesting indeed. And why was that? Well, Elizabeth, born in 1720, had very interesting parents. Her mother was Lady Jane Hamilton, and her father was Lord Archibald Hamilton. In fact, Elizabeth had double Hamilton in her background. Both of her parents descended from the great Hamilton family, who in the 17th and 18th centuries were considered amongst the top elite of Scottish aristocrats in England, Scotland, and Britain during that period. So she was from phenomenally important, let's say, aristocratic bloodline on both sides of her family. To examine her parents a bit more closely, her father, Lord Archibald Hamilton, was a younger son of the third Duke of Hamilton. He had a very interesting career initially in the army. He captained several ships that were involved in several very important battles. He commended himself throughout these moments. He also served as the governor of Jamaica in the early 18th century, between the years 1710 and 16. He also then later in his life distinguished himself as a serious politician and courtier. And I suppose also we should consider that when Elizabeth was a very young girl, Lord Archibald actually purchased a significant house, which is probably where Elizabeth spent most of her time growing up, an enormous mansion called Park Place, which was located just on the outskirts of Henley-on-Thames in Oxfordshire, which is going to be a very important scene, I think, for Elizabeth's upbringing, as we will soon find out. But in truth, it was actually Elizabeth's mother, really, who I think becomes the most interesting sort of background to Elizabeth's life. Her mother was this lady, Lady Jane Hamilton. Indeed, this is her portrait by Michael Dahl, which survives at Warwick Castle, which makes out how beautiful she was, and indeed remarked as one of the great beauties of her day. Lady Jane was a daughter of the Earl of Abercorn, also from Hamilton stock. But most importantly, as you'll see from her court roles, is she became an intimate and very important friend to none other than Frederick, the Prince of Wales. Indeed, Frederick made Lady Jane the first lady of the bedchamber. She was mistress of the robes and later the mistress of the privy purse. Now, Frederick, the Prince of Wales, is a phenomenally interesting figure. He, of course, was the eldest son of George II, who died before his father did, so he never became king. But Frederick, is one of these, I suppose, great what-ifs in history. If Frederick lived, what would Britain have been like? Frederick was a passionate connoisseur. He was a great collector of art. He was also phenomenally interested in music, as this painting by Philip Mercier shows of Frederick with his sisters. And it's very interesting that Lady Jane, Elizabeth's mother, was an enormously important confidant of the Prince of Wales. In fact, many people have suggested that they were in fact lovers, and Frederick was, or Lady Jane was the mistress to Frederick. It's never ever been proven. Lots of biographies like to really point out the fact that they must have been in bed with one another for her to sort of climb the ranks of courtly life so quickly as she did, and be so enormously, I suppose, connected to the prince in that period. But again, whether the evidence exists there to prove that or not is up to us to imagine. But they were incredibly close, and in fact, one of the closeness of them is suggested by the fact that Frederick, in fact, later in 1738, actually purchased Park Place from the Hamiltons, and had John Wootton, nonetheless, this great equestrian painter, but also landscape painter, produce several views of Park Place and Henley-on-Thames, including this rather nice one, which survives in the Royal Collection, showing a very nice group, a party below, which is supposed to depict, in fact, Frederick with Lady Jane. So there we go, the proximity. There is also this magnificent picture a group portrait of Frederick, Prince of Wales's wife, Augusta, the Princess of Wales, showing her with members of her family and household, which include at the back Lady Jane. In fact, Lady Jane can be seen dressed in white there in the corner, holding Prince Edward, later the Duke of York. And that little boy sat in front of them is the future George III. So imagine a full-length portrait commissioned by seemingly Augusta, the Princess of Wales, with her household. That man on the right is Sir William, Lord Boston, who's again another very important figure in the Prince of Wales and Princess of Wales's household at the moment. She's right there. She's in the proximity to this immediate court circle, which, again, considering Elizabeth is growing up amongst all of this, undoubtedly, I think really makes a case for how interesting her childhood must have been, surrounded by royalty. And in fact, the first portrait that we have of Elizabeth is this one, which survives at Warwick Castle, showing her before her marriage, probably in 1738. And it undoubtedly is also connected to Frederick in some way. I'm convinced of it. Firstly, we can see that she's dressed in this portrait as a young woman in masquerade dress. One of the things that Frederick, Prince of Wales, is known for is having a great love of fancy dress masquerades. And there's one that actually describes where they dressed up as courtiers of Henry VIII in hunting costume, and women wore feathers in their hats. It's remarked upon that this happened. And so you might imagine that this portrait was done to probably celebrate Elizabeth's coming out, let's say as a teenager, as she then was at the age of 18. But what makes this even more interesting, this painting, is it is a portrait by Philip Mercier, who was none other than Frederick's own portrait painter, and also a collector and a librarian to the prince. So this artist connected to the Prince of Wales is painting Lady Jane's daughter. So it's so fascinating to imagine, again, this world of artists, of balls, and of royalty that the young Elizabeth is sort of involving herself in, due to undoubtedly her mother's connections. And one of the final paintings produced before she was married in 1742 is Elizabeth with her brother William. This painting was sold by the Earl of Warwick in 2014, but it's very interesting. It shows this tenderness between Elizabeth and her younger brother William. And in case any of you know, this little boy would later become Sir William Hamilton, the great envoy extraordinaire to the court of Naples, and also would later, of course, bring none other than Lady Emma Hamilton to fame, of which much is known. So these connections between the Hamiltons, are endlessly fascinating. And indeed, just a final point really to point out in this portrait, one of the interesting aspects about Sir William's, that is Elizabeth's brother's upbringing, that is known, is that he also had this incredible proximity to particularly the young Prince of Wales and Prince George, the future George III. In fact, they were so close that they reputedly called each other brother. And this has also, I suppose, encouraged some historians to read along the lines that, well, was Sir William actually the illegitimate child of Frederick, the Prince of Wales? We don't know, there's no evidence, but it certainly, I think, is very interesting to consider. In 1742, though, Elizabeth made a remarkably good, from the face of it, marriage match to this fellow here. This is Francis Greville, who was a baron in the 18th century when Elizabeth met him. And later, in fact, after she had married him, was bestowed several titles, including Earl Brooke of Warwick Castle in 1746, and later, in fact, became the Earl of Warwick after another line of the earldom of Warwick. It's complicated, but it rested with another different unconnected family to Warwick Castle until the mid-18th century. But getting back to it, Elizabeth married into a very ancient family who owned a very big and beautiful castle in Warwickshire. Francis was the owner of Warwick Castle. And Francis, her future husband, was a very interesting man, again, in his own right. He was a great patron of the arts. He encouraged, of course, Canaletto to come and paint the castle. When he was off on his grand tour in Italy and France, he got none other than Jean-Marc to paint this very dandy portrait of him sat next to a harpsichord. And this also point towards Francis's other great love, which was music. So Elizabeth married into the Greville family, which were, very much interconnected, let's say, with the cultural world in which she would later also be, it seems, very interested in herself. Francis, I should say, also had a fascinating upbringing because he was orphaned at a very young age. He was actually brought up by women, very enlightened ones, including Frances, the Countess or Countess of Hertford, who famously lived in Marlborough and was a great patron of writers and poets, also a great patron of the arts. So Francis has this background, let's say, of very strong women in his life, which probably explains maybe why Elizabeth was of interest to him. They were married in 1742, and where were they married? This is also fascinating. They were married in Park Place. That is Elizabeth's home, which the Hamiltons had owned. And in fact, in 1742, Park Place was actually owned by Frederick, the Prince of Wales. We don't know whether the Prince of Wales was actually present at their wedding. I imagine that he probably would have been. And in fact, their wedding is marked in the local register that survives at the church today in Henley. So you might imagine that, this connection to royalty must have certainly been at the forefront of their minds. We know that when they were married, great furniture was made to celebrate their marriage. In fact, I managed to help a furniture dealer, Charles McKinnon, actually research into a magnificent set of chairs which have slowly been dispersed over the years, which were commissioned probably by the Earl and Elizabeth from John Hodson, who worked in mahogany and produced very fine and beautiful examples of furniture, and for a whole suite of new furniture that was made for the castle, again, very much in the tradition, let's say, of when a new marriage, an important marriage happened, new furniture had to be made to sort of to accompany this momentous and auspicious occasion. In fact, we can see from the payments in the accounts that as soon as they were married, practically, payments were made for new furniture that relate to this set of chairs, two of which Charles has, and other photograph shows that once decorated the entirety of Warwick Castle. But also their marriage also heralded other gifts which would also come, which have a slightly interesting royal connection, including the fact that Elizabeth's mother eventually gifted Francis her son-in-law and daughter magnificent royal portraits of Frederick, the Prince of Wales, in absolutely enormous trophy frames carved by Paul Pettit, who was a Huguenot woodcarver, the most extravagant Rococo, Baroque, I suppose, decoration that you might ever be able to afford. So it's so fascinating that, and these frames which survive at Warwick Castle today are this reminder of Elizabeth's influence, of her arrival into the Greville family, and indeed these gifts which are connected to the Prince of Wales. And in fact, Frederick, Prince of Wales, must have commissioned these. These must have been in the royal collection at some point and given to Lady Jane Hamilton, and through Lady Jane, his great friend, quasi-mistress perhaps, then through to the daughter. It's a fascinating link through history. In fact, not only are these portraits at Warwick Castle depicting Frederick, the Prince of Wales, but also his princess too, Lady or Princess Augusta. So these two paintings in their magnificent frame survive in the state dining room of the castle, which was built by Elizabeth's husband, Francis. So I suppose I wanted to look about, well, what other influences did Elizabeth have on her family life? And the truth is we actually know very little about the day-to-day goings-on, let's say, of her thoughts and her minds. Only a few of her letters really survive. from this period. But I think what's really interesting is where you see her influence come in and out of the castle. And as you might expect, a countess in the 18th century had the ability to influence many things, actually, in her household. But I think her influence becomes most apparent in the education of her children, which she must have spent a great deal of time and effort over. And in fact, Francis and Elizabeth, since their marriage in 1742, were very fortunate, really, to have lots of children. It was obviously a marriage at the beginning that was filled with love and produced several daughters. 3 daughters who survived into adulthood, 1 who died in childbirth, and also sons as well, 3 of them at least. And it's so interesting to think about, and I'm going to take a bit of time now looking at where Elizabeth's interest and her influence may be encountered. Well, firstly, thinking about her husband. Her husband was obviously a very proud man. He was continually petitioning through various court circles to increase his stock at court. He petitioned to become an earl in 1746, which was granted to him by the king. And in the last year of George II's reign, he actually petitioned to become the Earl of Warwick, a title which was vacant at the time, and it was granted to him. Titles meant a great deal to him, Francis, and you might imagine that having a great ancestral castle in Warwickshire might have influenced him. Certainly bringing back the earldom of Warwick, the title, with the architecture was important. But also, interestingly, 1 year after he was married, he was also made a Knight of the Thistle, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is is one of the top and most important orders of nobility in Scotland. Why was he bestowed this? Well, I can find no other reason, really, apart from the fact that, of course, his wife, Elizabeth, was in blood a Scot. She descended from the great Hamiltons, the Dukes of Hamilton, the Earls of Abercorn, important Scottish noblemen. And so this rubbed off, let's say, on her husband, who, when he was painted by Thomas Gainsborough, wanted to show himself as a very proud member of the Order of the Thistle, wearing that green ribbon, as you see here in his painting, which is now in Cincinnati. Elizabeth's son and heir, the next Earl of Warwick, also had an education which was, in most parts, so focused in Scotland. And again, you might imagine that this is the influence of the Countess, thinking about, her children should always remember where they're from. And indeed, it's her bloodline in a way which was far more prominent, let's say, than her husband's. So George, the next Earl of Warwick, born in 1746, although he was initially educated for a while at Eton, this education was swiftly sent off to Edinburgh University. He was, in fact, had several tutors. One of them was a Scot called William Pettoun, who was a librarian at Glasgow University, and who was also an amateur artist who painted George in this portrait, which survives at Warwick Castle. So he is tutored by Scots who are talented in the arts, but also George spent time at Edinburgh University as a lodger to William Robertson, the foremost, historian of the Scottish Enlightenment. I suppose the equivalent today would have been, could you imagine a young boy being tutored and living with, a famous historian like David Sarkey? That was the sort of equivalence. But again, the connection to Scotland, in this case to Edinburgh, was obviously of great importance. And of course, George particularly would famously have an enormously close bond with Elizabeth's brother, Sir William Hamilton. This was the brother who would become a great collector and antiquarian and diplomat in Naples. And George bought many important great works of classical art from his uncle, including famously the Warwick vase. So again, it's the influence of the mother that really comes through a lot in the life of the son and heir. But also this continues with the other sons. Charles Francis Greville, most famously, who discovered Emma Hamilton later on in his life, was also tutored in Edinburgh. He was sent off there. In fact, he was spent time studying with none other than the great Adam Ferguson, who was a very important philosopher and historian. Again, Scotland is where all of this takes place, and also the youngest son too, Robert Fulk Greville, was educated in Scotland, not in the southern part of England. So education certainly seems to have been, it seems clear, I think, Elizabeth's remit, at least in some sense. But what I think really makes a case for Elizabeth's interest in education is the fact that her daughters also had phenomenally interesting lives. Indeed, I think it's quite clear that Elizabeth was part of this Enlightenment movement, let's say, which placed greater emphasis than ever on the education of women, young women indeed. I wanted to briefly discuss some of them. Her oldest surviving daughter was this beautiful young girl here, Lady Louisa Augusta Greville. This is a miniature of her painted when she was a very young girl indeed. And it's so interesting that, well, what was Lady Louisa Augusta's childhood like? Well, it was one undoubtedly filled with the pursuit of art and beauty. In fact, Lady Louisa's brothers were all trained as artists, as amateur watercolor painters. But really, amongst all of the artists in the family, at this point, it was Lady Louisa who was the most promising of all of the family's artists. In fact, when she was a young girl, she was painted by a woman artist, Angelica Kauffmann, one of the founding members of the Royal Academy. This is Lady Louisa as, again, a sort of a teenager, painted by Kauffmann in the role of Hebe. I would love one day for this portrait to reappear because it is so fascinating. It was sold in the 1960s and has disappeared. I think it's going to reappear one day, and I can't wait until it does. So Elizabeth's daughters were painted by Angelica Kauffmann. It wasn't just Lady Louisa Augusta, in fact, but also other daughter, Frances Greville, later married into the Harper family. And unfortunately, Kauffmann's portrait of Frances with an E, doesn't survive, but many copies of it are known. So you can imagine a mother who gets her daughters to sit to a female artist, I think really says something about, let's say, the increasing interest, let's say, in training women in the role of the arts. But Lady Louisa and it seems her other sisters as well did much more than that, than just, sit to female artists, but they participated in art themselves. The Grevilles from an early period were patrons of the Sandbys, including Paul Sandby, who we know actually trained members of the family in the art of watercolor. The sons definitely did. Elizabeth's sons were trained as artists. But it's also clear that the daughters were as well. Now, this is very interesting because it's in the 18th century, really, in this exact period where, again, as part of a liberal education, a practice in the arts was considered, a growing interest amongst the aristocracy. And it's so interesting that particularly there are some very wonderful images of Elizabeth's daughters practicing art. And it's really Lady Louisa who is, I think, more talented than any other. This is a magnificent pastel by Francis Coates, which survives in the Duke of Beaufort's collection, showing Lady Louisa on the left there with her friend, Lady Anne Somerset, later Countess of Northampton. Louisa is aged 15 here. And this is a remarkable image, which actually shows that Lady Louisa is actually showing her friend a painting or a drawing or some work of art of hers, and is encouraging her friend to make a copy of it in needlework. What was Lady Louisa's speciality when it came to the arts? Well, this is an interesting question. It was not so much painting, although we know that she painted, and in fact, there are at least two drawings by her that survive, but Lady Louisa was a phenomenally talented engraver. In fact, her engravings were not only so highly admired that they were collected, including in the famous Richard Bull album at the British Museum, but she also won awards for her engravings. And again, it's quite amazing to imagine a woman undertaking engraving, which is a very physical job. You have to, cut into a copper plate with a burin to, make these images, which you then cover with, you cover plates with ink, and you need a printing press. It's a very dirty and it's a very difficult job. And an aristocratic woman, a young girl, in fact, was doing this in her lifetime, and exceedingly and doing incredibly well with it. She was in fact awarded gold medal at the Society of Artists in 1759 for her engravings. So she was, exhibiting, and her parents were obviously happy for her to do so. And in a way, it's interesting because to be an aristocrat really was never, particularly in this period, was a preoccupation of leisure alone. Yet it seems quite clear that Lady Louisa was very talented, but also, had ambitions and aspirations for it. This is one of her engravings in the British Museum, which shows her talent. But on the back is written that this was, in fact, Lady Louisa Greville's first etching that she ever made. Quite impressive, isn't it? And this of a tree, again, surviving the British Museum, on the back of it is written, said to be Lady Louisa's second etching. And Lady Louisa was phenomenal, really, in her technique. Indeed, it's again surprising to consider that, etching, engraving was considered a very, one that was acceptable for women in this period, but still quite in its infancy. The most famous example is Caroline Watson, I suppose you might say. But Lady Louisa's engravings are so often actually copying old masters, and not just any old masters, but old master drawings. She made copies of landscapes by Salvator Rosa, who was highly admired in the 18th century. She made many of these works on paper with a remarkable liveliness to them, which again I think shows her talent and aspiration and ambitions. And these were highly admired in the 18th century. Her most, I suppose, singular engravings, though, which you really get a sense of her great love, is engravings and views of her home, Warwick Castle, which of course was the house of her mother and her father. She made several views of the castle, one from the priory at Warwick in the 1750s. Again, she's a young girl when she's producing these, and perhaps one of the most beautiful, which survives, as far as I can tell, only in the British Museum at the moment, is another view of the castle, which at this moment in time was having its park redecorated by Capability Brown, who received the patronage of the Earl and Countess of Warwick, that is Lady Louisa's parents. So it's amazing to imagine that this is the world that these daughters are involved in, and they're producing works of art, and as you can see, are incredibly good at it. And sorry, this is flipping around the image to show you what the current view is today. Engravings, of course, are made in reverse. And interestingly, compared to Lady Louisa's engravings, this is an engraving that survives in the British Museum, produced by one of her brothers, Charles. And as you can see, it's quite clear that Charles was an absolutely rubbish engraver compared to his sister. Again, it's so interesting that this is obviously an art form which the whole family in some way were involved in. Charles was actually trained as it seems, a draftsman and a watercolorist, probably instructed by the Sandbys. In fact, when he was 12 years old, he was able to produce this lovely study of cherries, which was sold at Sotheby's in 2002. And I've also found in a private collection an enormous amount of Charles's later watercolors, which were inspired particularly by John Warwick Smith, an artist that the family were also patrons of later in the 18th century. So you imagine that that it seems that art and aesthetic pursuits were very much a part of the education, not only of the boys but the girls too. And actually, I now want to turn to the artistic promise of Elizabeth's youngest child, Lady Anne Greville, who's going to feature very heavily and a key figure in the later part of this talk. Lady Anne Greville as you can see from the slide there, did not live very long, died when she was only 23, was the last child that Elizabeth had, but she too was undoubtedly a phenomenally talented artist. This is a self-portrait that she made of herself, which is in the collection of Warwick Castle. It hasn't been displayed for, I think, decades, and which I think is an enormous shame, because it's a very sort of arresting image showing this young girl in a wig looking out at us. And unfortunately, it's in a terrible condition. But there is, in fact, written on the bottom of the image, which you can just see there, a little a little piece of paper written in Elizabeth's hand, the mother's hand, which describes the talents of her daughter. And in fact, we read in Elizabeth's own hand that Lady Anne Greville, that is her youngest daughter, was an incredibly talented artist. She made drawings of herself, and this supposedly was one of her attempts at doing so. She painted in crayons and pastels, and indeed it also explains here that Lady Anne Greville never had any drawing master, so she was self-taught, which is interesting to think, but also that she was taught in painting in some way in none other than Paris. And this, I think, is significant because we know actually from some of the only details of Elizabeth's life that survives is her comings and goings in and out of the country. And she spent enormous amounts of time in Paris. And Paris was one of the centers of women making art in the 18th century. We only have to think of other famous female artists who were working in that city at the time, including Vigée Lebrun. It was particularly in France that women artists were also making their mark, not only in England but in France too. So it seems that she was taught in France to draw, which is magnificent. And the sad thing is that very few of Lady Anne's drawings survive, but in Elizabeth's will, she actually does describe how many of them once used to exist. So whether these were destroyed or whether they've just been forgotten, neglected, I think is an awful shame. We also know that it seems that Lady Anne was in some way interested in architecture as well. There's this drawing of a beautiful ceiling which was inscribed by Lady Anne when she was 17 years old. Unfortunately, it was sold in 1997. I hope it reappears one day. But, what a phenomenally talented young girl this was. And again, architecture is something I'm going to come back to. Lady Anne's will, in fact, that she made too gives a sense, I think, of how interesting this young daughter of a countess was. We read that she had a forte piano, that she gave away lots of her books and clothes to one of her servants, Henrietta Butson. She also gave money to a nun at an abbey in Paris, which is probably also where she received some of her education in the 18th century, which is interesting too. And most importantly, she asked in her will that any drawings that her mother didn't want were to be burnt and destroyed, which is an awful shame because hardly any of them do exist. But what does exist in the record office and in the Greville archive are these sketchbooks, many of which are unattributed. Undoubtedly, some of them were by the men of the family, but I think some of these too must have been produced by the women of the Greville family, the daughters of Francis and Elizabeth too. There are many of these lovely views of the castle from the park, which, as you can see, are from different perspectives. And also, most tellingly, I think there's this portrait in one of the books. Again, I have no idea who this is a portrait of, but I think, or at least it seems, I think, very plausible that this might be of the matriarch of the family, Elizabeth, who, it seems quite clear was such a gave such a great passion and energy to the education of her children. I'd like to imagine at least that perhaps this is a portrait of Elizabeth by one of her sons or daughters. One day we'll know, but or more, one day we'll never find out, I suppose. But to come on to, well, the great passion of Elizabeth's life was not only her children and her children's education, but also the most, I suppose, documented example of her existence on this earth was, in fact, an incredible love affair which she embarked on in the late 1750s and the 1760s, despite the fact that that it seems that her relationship with the Earl of Warwick, her husband Francis Greville, started off rather well. They had lots of children, as we discussed earlier. It seems that by 1759 their marriage had cooled somewhat, and onto the scene steps this fellow here, General Robert Clarke, who it seems became an enormously quickly a close confidant of Elizabeth. Now, I suppose Robert was in fact the complete opposite of her husband. Elizabeth's husband, Francis, I failed to mention, was very sickly. He was a very frail man. And in fact, one of the things that does survive is an enormous set of, receipts and lists of apothecary information, particularly relating to medicines that were purchased for her husband and for her children. Elizabeth's husband, was a very sickly man, we hear, and was also very small physically. However, this fellow, General Robert Clarke, was not. He was a colonel, a general in the army. He had distinguished himself in several battles during various wars in the mid-18th century. He was a very fit fellow by all accounts. And in the late, in the mid-18th century, lots of people give various accounts of him, that he was also Scottish, which again connects to Elizabeth's interest. So Horace Walpole called him not very sound, but quick, bold, and adventurous. In a way, I think he was a bit more like Elizabeth's father. And maybe you want to read into that whatever you want. He was also described as being a man of sense, a great talker, but also being rather dull and boring. In fact, Madame Geoffrin, that's how you pronounce it, described that she could not even think of General Clarke, even now, without trembling all over. There was something about this fellow. But more importantly, in some of Clarke's letters that survive in the British Museum to the Earl of Shelburne, who was a mutual friend of the Earl and Countess of Warwick as well, there are many interesting accounts that all of a sudden General Clarke is, visiting Warwick Castle more and more often. In fact, 1759, he writes to the Earl of Shelburne, "I'm going to Warwick this summer. My friend Lady Brooke is there." And by the end of 1759, he spends the summer there. He spends a lot of time at the races, visiting many of the other, let's say, the other aristocrats locally. And then by 1763, we read that that Clarke writes, "I shall have the greatest regard for Lady Warwick as long as I live, and perhaps longer too, if in the shades below." It seems that that by 1760 at least, or by 1759, Elizabeth was embarking on a full-blown love affair with Clarke. And indeed, how else can we substantiate this, you might ask, Adam? What is the evidence? What will you say? How can you prove it? Well, to come back to the list of Elizabeth's children, you might notice that between her last son and her last daughter, there is a period of 9 years. And Elizabeth, in 1760, when Lady Anne was born, was 40 years old, which is actually quite an age for a woman in the 18th century to give birth. And it seems quite clear also from other letters that Lady Anne's birth was marked by a certain scandal in the family. So this again is Lady Anne's self-portrait. We actually have this remarkably interesting letter written by another of Elizabeth's daughters, Louisa, in 1760, describing the birth of Lady Anne, her sister, explaining that she was born on Tuesday morning, that Elizabeth was not well. It was a monstrous time, as you can imagine, for a lady of 40 giving birth. Lady Anne was not big, but has a face like an apple, which is very nice. Blue eyes and very dark hair. They say it will be very pretty, which is a nice way to describe your baby sister, I suppose. She also writes that it is to be christened on Sunday, because I believe my father and my brother go to Warwick Castle on Monday. So the christening had to happen very quickly, it seems. But most of all, in this letter, which survives in the record office and in a way has never truly been understood properly before, I think, in the context of Elizabeth's life, also gives us a really interesting insight into the nature of the birth of this little girl. She actually describes that there's somebody else hanging around Elizabeth's chambers, it seems, or at least Elizabeth's house, when Lady Anne is bought, and that is a certain C with an underscore. Louisa doesn't make clear who this C is, but it's obviously Clark. And why is he hanging around? Louisa describes that it is really beyond my comprehension how anyone can bring themselves to like such a creature, that is Clark, and with what composure she speaks of him to my father, and that anyone can not only suffer him to come into the house, but be extremely civil to him. I know if she was my wife, it should not be so. I am scolded almost every day because I cannot for my life be civil, but perhaps I have already said too much. This letter makes it absolutely crystal clear that I think Lady Anne, this new little born girl, is quite obviously the love child of Elizabeth, Countess of Warwick, and Robert Clark, that is not entirely born from the Earl. And what else do we also have to suggest this? Well, only a very short while after her birth, a separation contract is written up. And indeed, it seems that this separation was enormously painful for both the Earl and Countess. In fact, it was also financially painful. The Earl granted Elizabeth £2,000 a year to be settled in £500 payments each year, which was an enormous sum, and really did all that he could to get Elizabeth to sort of to change her mind and to also stay away from him, which the case may be. There are letters. This I should explain is the separation indenture, the contract of their formal separation. But earlier, we actually read in her letters that she is doing lots of interesting things. She actually writes to the Earl of Sherborne, particularly to try and help her friend Colonel Clark to actually get a better job in the army, and actually sticks her neck out on the line and says, do mention my name to the king or his ministers if it helps him progress his career. So it's quite obvious that she's not afraid to show the fact that she's how to put it is obviously giving her patronage to Clark in a very serious and very public way. There are also in 1765 a great deal of things that happen and that are accounted. In fact, there is a moment in 1765 in the late summer where Elizabeth is actually locked out of her house by the Earl of Warwick, who doesn't want her to come and live there anymore. In fact, their house at the time was in Hill Street in London. And it's very sad to read these letters where she expresses, this enormous sadness of the extreme dislike Lord Warwick has to his wife, and the opposite is true as well. Lord Warwick, her husband, actually writes to the Earl of Shelbourne to help him get rid of Clark. It's so interesting that he writes to Shelbourne, and again in these letters which survive at the British Museum, sort of asking Shelbourne to help him sort of not ever meet Clark in person because he just can't face it. He's very much trying to avoid them ever meeting again. These are fascinating things to read, but also actually tries to get an appointment for Clark where he would be sent away, and that perhaps he believes his wife will forgive him and come back to him. And he, in fact, writes that harder was it for superior beings thus to treat me in my concerns, but extracted of that I was a husband, master of my family, and the light to keep up. Not to fall down would have been a great sense and propriety. The reverse, too, was surely the case. The man plucked up courage. The woman, his wife, was disappointed in her ideas, and thus finished our melancholy story. He asks for Clark to be sent away where he hoped wife and husband could be reconciled, but unfortunately it never happened. But you feel from these letters what a great sadness, a shame it was. And indeed, in this story of the Countess being locked out of her house, even made the papers and diaries at the time, so people knew about it. They saw it. And one of the interesting things is that payments start to appear in the Earl's accounts to the Countess of £500 quarterly. And one of the things that the Countess decided to do was actually to move out of her husband's lodgings altogether, and that Clark and her would actually live together in a state of sort of semi-public nature, you might suggest, which again would have been incredibly scandalous at the time. They turned to none other, in fact, to John and Robert Adam, the great neoclassical architects, to actually build them a house on Mansfield Street, which would be called Clark House. This actually has been written about by Colin Tom of UCL, a fascinating piece of patronage, which seems to have actually come mostly from the Countess herself, rather than from Clark. There was a bundle of drawings of this building, which was sold at Christie's many years ago, which also make it clear how proud the Countess was that she didn't have to get into debts to build the house and to furnish it, that it was this money from the separation from her husband that came to sort of give her that freedom to pursue the building of this wonderful piece of architecture, which we know was enormously important. It was one of the Adamses' first really great big Marylebone townhouses in this new part of London, which was up and coming, filled with beautiful decorations and furniture in the most important neoclassical styles. And I'm sure that Lady Anne's drawing we saw of that ceiling must in some way relate to this house, which was being built for her mother. And what's even more interesting is that there is a floor plan of the house, which is supposedly drawn in Elizabeth's hand herself. So it's quite clear that this woman is also acting perhaps, in a very hands-on way with the architectural patronage of the Adamses. And this is, again, it's so fascinating to consider this lady, separated from her husband, is living or trying to live this independent life, which is really quite admirable in the 18th century, considering the shunning that would have occurred due to such a public and such a painful separation process. So this is the plan which survives at Manchester University. And here at Hawes Bank, we actually see Francis, the poor husband, having to pay for all of this building work. And in fact, the Adamses are listed there as being receivers of all of this money. So it's interesting too that letters survive to show that that one of the things that Francis also started to do was deny the Countess things like jewelry which she had been promised. So there's letters which survive in the record office showing how important it is for her heirs to receive her jewelry and not to be stolen away from her. So again, it becomes very petty, their separation. And one of the most petty of all, I think, of pieces of evidence of their separation comes in the form of a painting. We know that just before their separation at the castle, there was a double portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds, which is listed in one of the inventories, showing Elizabeth and her husband, the Earl, together with a map of Warwick Castle in front of them. And actually, this painting hasn't survived. But when it was engraved in the early 19th century, the painting had obviously changed because it looked like this. As you can see, Elizabeth has gone, and all is left is the husband. And what I think has quite clearly happened here is that this painting has literally been cut in half, and the wife has been gotten rid of. And unfortunately, this painting just doesn't survive. And I think one of the reasons that it doesn't survive, again, is because of this reminder of this terribly painful divorce, which happened in the 18th century and obviously was later neglected as a work of art. So imagine cutting your wife out of the visual history altogether, which is fascinating to consider. So interestingly, their relationship between Elizabeth and Clark continued fairly well. And indeed, did Elizabeth believe in love? Well, we can even answer that with a very interesting letter that she wrote to the Earl of Shelburne, which describes actually some letters and some books by Rousseau that she's been reading. And it's so interesting about what Elizabeth writes about Rousseau. She actually describes particularly one of his famous books, which was published in her lifetime, called Julie, which is all about essentially a young girl who marries somebody, or falls in love with, I should say, somebody much below her class. And she can't marry him because she's from a high level of society and he's not. And so she eventually marries somebody else of her class and is terribly upset and miserable about it. And it's so interesting that that she writes quite clearly in this letter that Julie in Rousseau's novel ought to have gone away with her lover after the first steps. As much as you go upon family, yet you would have thought it abominable to have acted otherwise. The idea that, particularly what Rousseau is suggesting, is that the constraints of society really get in the way of true love. And it's quite obvious that I think Elizabeth in this letter is almost looking at her own life and her own separation from her husband and a love affair with Clark in this way. But I think in the later years of her life, Elizabeth was also continually, right to the end, a very keen mother. And in fact, it's so interesting when her son later, who the next Earl of Warwick, is inheriting the earldom, is starting, particularly her son George, would spend enormous sums of money and in fact would bankrupt himself actually buying works of art. It's her letters to her son which really give us a sense of how bad the situation is with her son, the next heir. She writes to him in very chastising ways, explaining that we must no longer flatter ourselves. You are advancing towards the brink of a precipice. You must stop immediately and turn to a path that may lead to the reinstatement of your affairs. She truly chastises her son in a very serious way to stop buying art, to stop being in debt to people. And it's certainly so interesting that she makes this case that the happiness of her children is enormously important to her, but most importantly, I think what also comes across in these letters is that she's worried about her income being affected by it too, as the fact is that her income, which was assured to her from her marriage and also from her separation, still had to be maintained by her son. So what happened to Clark and Elizabeth at the end? Well, it's quite interesting that after her husband died in 1773, Clark and Elizabeth did get married. They married in a private ceremony in a chapel connected to the ambassadors of Britain in France. And so again, France being a very important part, it seems, in her life, which also might explain that lovely portrait by Nattier. But it's so sad and interesting to consider that Clark actually died in 1797 in an incredibly awkward circumstance. It seems that towards the end of his life, he was also having affairs of his own. And in fact, he is later recounted of having died in the bed of a young person who lived on Cleveland Street, who was quite obviously his mistress. And it's a humiliating story, but Elizabeth's actually her oldest son, the Earl as it was at the time, had to actually go and pick up Clark's body and take it back into in a carriage back to their house, which Robert Adam and John Adam had designed, of course, for them both. So it's quite a sort of sad and slightly humiliating end. And it's certainly also the case towards the end of Elizabeth's life that she had to, particularly after the death of Clark, to rein in her spending. She eventually moves out of this magnificent neoclassical house, which is later purchased by Mr. Hope, great collector of art, in which much is written. But also she decides to live in other various places in London. She buys herself a house in Richmond Green and takes her furniture with her from her neoclassical mansion. She also then later lives at Dover Street in the heart of London. So she sort of moves around and starts living by herself. And it's so interesting that one of her last letters that survives describes her, where she writes, "Relative to myself, my income is sufficiently to tally with the expenses of my establishment, and living in a quiet, retired manner, which I like, and I reckon becoming old age." And it's so fascinating that the final, important document connected to Elizabeth is this one, her will, which is phenomenal for its level of detail. Not only does she have her name written at the top, in such a bold way, "I, Elizabeth, Countess Dowager Brooke and Warwick," obviously proud of her titles, but it's absolutely filled with minute gifts which she makes to these incredibly important people in her life. All her grandchildren are listed. Particularly, lots of money is allotted to her granddaughters and to the women in her life. Servants are given incredible gifts, little trinkets, little miniatures. Artworks are also given to people who are very close to her. It's a phenomenal insight into her. I think her material world. It's obvious that she lived, with some pretty extraordinary and beautiful things, fine furniture that she gives away, fine paintings that she gives away, and also trinkets as well. And the most intriguing thing is when she died in 1800 at the age of 80, the most telling and most curious thing is that she did not want to be buried next to her husband, the Earl of Warwick, who had, before he died, actually established a new crypt in St. Mary's Church, which is where the Greville family were buried. This is the entrance to it. Elizabeth did not want to be put there. Where did she end up? Well, it's sort of a strange ending of the story. She ended up not too far away from this place. You probably recognize this as the interior of Westminster Abbey. This is when the late Queen was lying in state there as part of the funeral. And Elizabeth's body is in a vault, a crypt, not so far away. In fact, Elizabeth, it seems, left her burial not to her son, but to her brother, Sir William Hamilton, whose actual records of what he was doing, organizing the tomb and the plaque for her records. She decided to be buried in the vault of the Earls of Abercorn, which of course is the family associated with her mother, Lady Jane Hamilton. And it's so interesting that that it's in Westminster Abbey where she's buried, and not with the Warwick and Greville family, who were all lying in state, or lying until the Judgment Day, I suppose, in St. Mary's Church. But most interestingly, in her brother's papers is this final, I think, final draft of what was supposed to be written on a plaque, probably on her coffin. And it's so fascinating what it explains. She's obviously proud of her rank. We read, "Elizabeth, Countess Brooke and Countess of Warwick, eldest daughter of Lord Archibald Hamilton and of Lady Jane Hamilton, married to Francis Brooke, an Earl of Warwick, in 1742, by whom she had 3 sons and 5 daughters, died 24th of February 1800, in the 80th year of her age." And what an interesting and fascinating life it was. She's obviously a woman whose life was dedicated to passion, to encouraging the arts in her children, to aesthetic pursuits, which were really right at the forefront of the education, particularly of women artists and of women in this period. Not to mention the fact that her sons were all amateur artists as well, and great patrons of the arts in their lifetimes too. And I suppose, ending this talk, I wanted to just point out that it's so fascinating that with these few documents, with these almost traces of archival evidence, we can all of a sudden get so much more of a fuller and richer picture of the life of someone that we might see in a painting. And it's so interesting that Elizabeth's painting is now on the other side of the Atlantic at the Frick Collection in New York. This was obviously painted by at probably one of the flourishing moments of her beauty in her mid-30s by Jean-Marc, who also painted, of course, a husband, the Earl of Warwick. But what a fascinating and interesting life that can be drawn together through these documents. If you've made it all the way through this lecture, I hope you found it interesting. I salute you. And, well, I look forward to describing another forgotten life of Warwick Castle another day. Thank you very much for listening indeed.